If we do not learn from history, we are doomed to repeat it. Now, you've probably all heard that opinion before, but there's another opinion attributed to Mark Twain, and he said this, that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. That is, the exact same event doesn't repeat itself, but similar events do repeatedly. And the chapter that I've been asked to preach on today, 2 Samuel 13, illustrates that truth beautifully. Now, this story is the story, it's a history of a family, and 5 members of this family love and hate, deceive and abuse, ignore and indulge, betray and plot against each other. So let's meet them, shall we? First of all, let's meet King David, head of state of the United Kingdom of Israel and Judah, a man known for his decisive military strategy and also for his decisiveness in getting the woman he wants, Bathsheba, and killing her husband, Uriah, to cover his tracks. Second, we meet Prince Amnon, David's eldest son and heir to the throne, the man everybody in Israel looks to be the next king. Third, we meet Jonadab. Jonadab is the best friend of Prince Amnon. For Jonadab, the king is Uncle David. And fourth, we meet Prince Absalom, second in line to the throne. And finally, and most importantly for this story, we meet David's daughter, Tamar. Beautiful, compassionate, resourceful. If this story is anyone's, then it's hers. A story which illustrates that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And this is how the story begins. Prince Amnon is infatuated with his half-sister Tamar, daughter of King David, full sister of Prince Absalom. He becomes so obsessed with Tamar that it affects his mental and his physical health. His frustration is extreme because Tamar, being a royal princess, her welfare is monitored very closely. And as the story tells us at the beginning here, it seemed to Amnon that it was impossible for him to do anything to her. You notice that Amnon wants to do something to her, not with her. But Amnon has his friend Jonadab, the king's nephew, his closest friend. And the story tells us Jonadab was a very crafty man. Not just crafty, but unprincipled. So Jonadab concocts this cunning plan. And he says to Amnon, Amnon, get into bed, pretend to be truly ill. And then when the king comes to visit you, ask that Tamar be permitted to come to visit you so that she can cook some of your favorite cakes, the ones you love so much. And the two of you, brother and sister, can spend some quality time together so that your spirits can be revived. That's all. Jonadab doesn't tell Amnon what to do when he's alone with Tamar, but Amnon doesn't need to be told. And it couldn't be easier. David comes to visit Amnon, and while he's there, Amnon says, please, do you think Tamar would be able to come and visit me? Make some of those cakes that I love. And David says, of course. So David asks Tamar to go and visit her brother Amnon. And Tamar is on her way. And while she's on her way, let's take the time to reflect on the fact that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Because just 2 chapters before this story, that's 2 Samuel chapter 11, I think you've looked at it recently, the story of David and Bathsheba. Back then, you remember, David lusted after Bathsheba. And that story began with David in bed, and then out of bed, and then back in bed again. And now, in the story we're looking at now, Amnon lusts after Tamar, and Jonadab says, get into bed. Just as David lay with Bathsheba, and just as he persistently tried to get Uriah to lie with Bathsheba, Jonadab tells him, lie down. And just as David sent Bathsheba, now David sends Tamar. You know, even the most dull-witted reader can see how these 2 stories are beginning to rhyme. And they continue to rhyme. You look at verse 7. Then David sent home to Tamar, saying, go to your brother Amnon's house and prepare food for him. So Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house. In that previous story of David and Bathsheba, David took Bathsheba from her house, brought her to his house, and afterwards sent her back to her house. And David also kept telling Uriah to go down to his house in order to spend time with Bathsheba, to cover up what David had done. And here we are once again. David is telling Tamar to go from her house to go to Amnon's house. And of course, eventually she ends up in Absalom's house. But there is more going on here in this story, because in this story in chapter 13 that we're looking at, Amnon and Tamar are brother and sister. And the story won't allow us to avoid that truth. If you just scan the story and just notice how many times we're told, we read, go to your brother Amnon's house. So Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house. So Tamar took the cakes to Amnon, her brother. Come, lie with me, my sister. No, my brother. No, my brother. Absalom said to her, has Amnon, your brother, been with you? Be quiet, my sister. He is your brother. Now, Tamar's kindness and compassion for her allegedly ill brother is touching, but of course entirely misplaced. And this story contrasts the way in which Tamar takes that dough and kneads it and shapes it and bakes it and then brings those beautiful cakes to her brother. Contrasts that with the physical force of Amnon's callous and brutal attack on his sister. His sister. When Amnon grabs Tamar, what he says literally is, come, lie down. And when the deed is done, what he says literally is, get up, get out. And when the deed is done, Tamar is no longer my sister. You look at verse 17. beg your pardon, I was in the wrong chapter. He called the young man who served him and said, "Put this woman out of my presence. She's no longer my sister. She is this woman." That tells us most of what we need to know about Amnon. But what do we learn about Tamar? Well, it's quite clear in this story that Tamar is the innocent party. The story emphasizes that Amnon, Tamar resists for as long as she can. The Bible does none of the fancy tap dancing around this that happens so often. There's no blaming the victim. There's no finding excuses for the culprit. There's no saying, well, she deserved it. She asked for it. She should have seen what was coming. What do you expect if you go into a man's bedroom? No shifting of blame from the culprit to the victim. Just the unvarnished truth. Tamar, well, just listen to Tamar's frantic words as she tries to fend off Amnon. Verse 12. "No, my brother, do not force me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do anything so vile. As for me, where could I carry my shame? And as for you, you'd be as one of the scoundrels in Israel." She is so desperate that she actually suggests that if Amnon stops, she will talk to the king so the two of them can marry, even though she must know that legally that is absolutely impossible. But Tamar is like a drowning person snatching at straws, desperately trying to do anything to stop Amnon. But he would not listen to her. And being stronger than she was, he forced her and lay with her. Now, surely, I think we say to ourselves, Tamar's going to find some sympathy here from her other brother, Absalom. Unfortunately, not. Absalom doesn't give his sister any kind of sympathy, but he does ask a question. He doesn't ask, "Tamar, what happened?" Rather, he asks, "Has your brother Amnon been with you?" In other words, Absalom suspected what Amnon would get up to, but he said nothing. Tamar had challenged Amnon long and loud, but Absalom tells her, "Be quiet." Tamar is heartbroken. She acts as though somebody has died, and in a way, that's true. She covers herself with ashes, she tears her clothes, she cries aloud, she's utterly desolate and distraught. And what does Absalom say? Don't take it to heart. Don't take it so seriously. That is the last thing she needed to hear. It wasn't just Amnon and his lust, not just Jonadab's cunning plan. It's also Absalom who shuts down Tamar, takes matters into his own hands, instead of focusing on what Tamar needed. All of them have failed her. And then it's David's turn. David's turn to fail her. Now, he is angry. We'll give him that. Verse 21. When King David heard of all these things, he became very angry. Well, he's been angry before, of course. And where has David been angry before? Well, in that other story we were looking at, the one with David and Bathsheba and Uriah. You remember when Nathan told David that parable of the rich man who took the poor man's sheep. David was so self-centered, so self-obsessed, he couldn't see that Nathan was actually talking about Bathsheba, Uriah, and him. So he was angry. And here he is, angry once again. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Now, as far as we know, David never said anything to Amnon. Why? Well, in the Hebrew text, we're not told. But in the ancient Greek version of this story, and in a number of other ancient manuscripts, there is a motivation given. And some modern English Bibles, including the one I'm reading from here, the NRSV, they include that motivation. And here it is. David would not punish his son Amnon because he loved him, for he was his firstborn. Now that might well be the reason, but remember, being the firstborn had political consequences. The firstborn would be the heir to the throne. So then, good political reasons for keeping this quiet. If this gets out, it would be bad publicity for the royal family. No appearances on the Oprah Winfrey show on this particular matter. Tamar will just have to understand. And what might Tamar understand? Well, I think she understood this. She understood that her attacker was not a stranger, but somebody she knew, her brother. She understood that this attack took place not in some dark alley, but in her brother's home. She understood that Amnon exploited her kindness so that he could violate her. She understood that she had said no, and her no had been ignored. She understood that when the rest of the family heard what had happened, her brother said, "Be quiet, don't take it to heart." And her father said nothing. And I think she also understood this, living as she did round about the year 1000 BC. She also understood that her life was destroyed. There could be no marriage with anybody now, not now. No possibility of children or a family life, not even respectability, because her name would now not be mentioned in polite company. Because in this culture, with people like Amnon and Absalom around, she would be the one who would bear the shame more than Amnon. And Tamar's tragedy has happened too many times. David, her father, Amnon and Absalom, her brothers, Jonadab, her cousin, the people who should have protected her, actually betrayed her or didn't seek justice for her. And in the same way, too many women and many men, boys and girls, have been sexually exploited and have had to bear the pain in silence, and often seen the culprit protected or even defended, as Amnon was, by David. And like Tamar, many will also know their attacker, being less safe at home than with strangers. All of that would have been bad enough. All of it would be bad enough if those who were guilty didn't claim the name of God. But how much more must it make God weep when those who claim his name are guilty too? Whenever we justify domestic abuse or sexual abuse, we take Amnon and his family as our model and leave Tamar to her fate. Now, this story has a sequel. Briefly, this is what happens. Absalom organizes a feast. He invites all of his brothers, sons of David, to that feast. He asks David whether Amnon can go to the feast as well. David says, yes, they may do that. Amnon goes to the feast. Once he gets there, Absalom gives the nod to his servants. His servants murder Amnon. A rumor spreads that all of the king's sons have been killed. Mayhem breaks out. But Jonadab wants to dampen down David's fears and says, do not worry, my lord. It's not all of them. It's just Amnon. Do not take this to heart. Absalom flees into exile and he lives there for 3 years. And one of the things that we learn from this sequel is that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Now, we've already seen that, of course. We've seen the rhyming between Amnon and Tamar, recalling David and Bathsheba. There was Amnon in bed and David in bed. There's Amnon lying down, there's David lying down. There's Bathsheba moving from one house to another. There's Tamar moving from one house to another. But there are others as well. Back in that story of David and Bathsheba, when David finally gets the news that Uriah is dead, he sends the message back to his general, and the message is, do not let this matter trouble you. And in this story, when Absalom meets Tamar, he says to her, do not take this to heart. Back in the other story, David in his palace sent Uriah off to meet his end, to a battle where his death had already been decided. And now in this story, David is in his palace and he sends Amnon off to meet his end, to a feast where Absalom has already decided his death. When Amnon arrives, Absalom's command to his servants is, strike Amnon and kill him. Exactly the same words David used to get rid of Uriah. Back in that story, David thought nobody would know what he was up to. And now, in this story, David doesn't know what his own sons are up to. Now, some of you might say, well, exactly the same, is it? Because when David sent Uriah off to his death, he knew what he was doing. Here, when David sends Amnon off to his death, he didn't know what he was doing. Precisely. Precisely. Because history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And let not our hearts warm too much in favor of Absalom. I noticed a little bit going on in the chat concerning this earlier on. All right. Let not our hearts warm too warmly for Absalom. Absalom is far from being the noble avenger of his sister. In the stories that follow, we see just how naked Absalom's ambition to sit on the throne is. Don't let Absalom fool us like he did David. Amnon's rape of Tamar gives Absalom the perfect excuse, because in killing Amnon, first in line to the throne, Absalom then moves up from second in line to first in line. Don't think that Absalom hadn't thought of that. Amnon's rape had given him the perfect cover for his ambition. When Absalom met Tamar after her ordeal, he told her, don't take it to heart. Don't take it so seriously. And when David was bereft, thinking all his sons had died, Jonadab said, don't take it to heart. It's only Amnon. But what should we take to heart from this story? What should lodge in our memories and make a difference? More than anything else, I think, we need to remember that this is Tamar's story. A woman who suffered and whose family did nothing. The people who should and could have done something didn't. And the one who did do something, Absalom, I believe, is really thinking of his own ambition. You know, like David, perhaps, you know, when we're watching the news, we might say to ourselves, that's never right. That's never right. But like David, we might be angry, but we're not angry enough to do anything about it. And when we don't do something about an injustice, then we simply encourage Amnon and Absalom and condemn Tamar to her fate. The standard excuse we give, and I know these are the kinds of thoughts that have been through my head over the years, the standard kind of excuse is, well, you know, I just don't think I should get involved in this kind of thing. You know, as a good church member, I think I need to be a witness for the gospel, and getting involved with justice and injustice, all that messy stuff, you know, well, in any case, once Jesus returns, all will be well. The problem is that in the meantime, all is not well. Not just for the way in which many women are treated, which is what this story we've been looking at is concerned with. Not just the way women are treated, but also in the revival of racism, anti-Semitism, the obscene disparity between the world's rich and poor, and on and on and on. You know, Jesus never said that injustice was something we could just push to one side and wait for him to return. Jesus said to the respectable religious people of his time, you lot, you know, he said, you lot, you pay tithe on mint and rue and all kinds of herbs, but you've taken your eye off the ball. You haven't paid attention to the most important matters. And What are the most important matters? Well, according to Jesus, when he was speaking to these folk, he said the most important matters are justice, mercy, and faith. And when it comes to living the gospel, says Jesus, justice, mercy, and faith trump everything else. And if we really do want Jesus to return, to put an end to all of the injustice in the world, maybe more people would listen to us if we more seriously tried to model now the kind of justice we're looking forward to try to model in the here and now what justice, mercy, and faith really look like. So we could say, by the way, this is the sort of thing we're talking about. But in the meantime, Tamar is waiting for somebody to understand what she's been through, to speak truth to power, and acknowledge the wrong she suffered. While she's waiting, time moves on and on and on. History isn't repeating itself, but it rhymes and rhymes and rhymes.